Being unloved is a wound, but it can heal. Esther Valentine always wore gloves. Not delicate lace gloves, or the cashmere kind meant for warmth in winter. She wore medical latex gloves, thin, pale blue, pulled all the way from her fingertips to her wrists. The first day she walked into the cubicle farm at the magazine, every single person noticed them, but nobody asked. New Yorkers are exceptionally skilled at ignoring things that demand an explanation. Esther worked for 3 years as an assistant editor at Crossroads, handling the orphan submissions, rejected poems, half-finished short stories, rambling confessions. She sat at her desk in the corner like a plant someone had forgotten on a windowsill, quietly, slowly photosynthesizing. At lunchtime, when her colleagues walked to the deli on the corner to grab sandwiches together, she sat on the fire escape steps alone, still wearing her gloves, tearing open a bag of whole wheat bread and chewing in tiny, measured bites. She never made physical contact with anyone. If someone in the break room accidentally brushed her shoulder, she recoiled as if she had been scalded. When her department head, Megan, tried to hug her at a celebration party, Esther went rigid, arms pinned to her sides like a locked door. Over time, people in the corridors began stepping aside instinctively to give her space, as though her loneliness were an illness that required a safe distance. No one knew she lived in a walk-up in Brooklyn, the walls of her apartment plastered with post-it notes, every single one bearing the same sentence, "You don't belong here." And no one knew that every night before bed she checked the lock on her door 7 times, because her father had stormed out one night and never come back, and afterwards her mother had spent 2 full years forgetting she still had a daughter. Alcohol was the best amnesiac she knew, and when it failed, there were sleeping pills and the fleeting warmth of strangers. Esther learned to cook her own dinner at 8. At 12, she learned to forge her mother's signature on school forms. At 16, she stood outside the school counselor's office for 20 minutes, then turned and walked away, because she had no idea how to explain to a stranger why she wasn't happy. Unhappy felt like a ridiculously extravagant word for what she felt. What she felt was more like being hollowed out. A tree whose core had been devoured by insects, still desperately holding its bark together. She once read a report about Romanian orphanages. The children abandoned under the Ceausescu regime had been tied to their cribs as infants. No one had ever held them, no one had ever spoken to them. They didn't cry, because they had long ago learned that crying was useless. Researchers called it emotional atrophy, when a person's emotional needs go unanswered for so long that the soul begins to waste away, like a muscle left unused. Esther thought that phrase was devastatingly precise. Emotional atrophy. Her mother had not been evil, just a woman who had been broken by life and had pickled herself in alcohol until she became a piece of dried meat stripped of all moisture and softness. Her mother had given her food, given her clothes, given her a roof, but she had never given her a hug, the warmth of 2 arms wrapped around her, the scent of hair when a cheek presses close, the resonance of a chest humming against her own. These things were as rare in Esther's life as rain in a desert, so scarce they were almost mythical. The shift came on her 29th birthday. That day, New York was drenched in a cold rain. The March wind, heavy with moisture from the Hudson, tunneled through the gaps between skyscrapers like tiny daggers. Esther worked late, and by the time she walked out of the office at 9, the rain was so heavy that an umbrella had become pointless. She stood under the portico for a moment, hesitating, then decided to head for the subway as usual. That was when she heard a thin, reedy cry coming from behind a dumpster. It was a cat, or rather, half a cat. It was so emaciated that it looked like a skeleton wrapped loosely in skin. Its gray-white fur was plastered to its body by the rain, one eye gummed shut with pus, its left hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle. It was huddled against the edge of a soggy cardboard box, expending what seemed like the last of its strength to send out a distress signal that evolution had long since left behind. Esther stopped walking. She looked at the cat, and the cat looked back at her with the one eye it could still open. In that moment, the sound of the rain, the wind, the distant sirens, it all fell away. The world contracted to just the two of them. Esther crouched down, her rubber gloves making a faint squeaking sound in the wet. She reached towards the cat, pulled her hand back, reached again, and pulled back again 3 times. She was afraid, not of being scratched, but of the touch itself. That warm, soft, living texture. She had not voluntarily experienced it in so many years. "You're just like me," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the rain. "You've been thrown away too." And then she took off her gloves. It was the first time in 11 years that she had touched another living creature with her bare fingertips. The cat's fur was soaking wet, but the skin beneath was alarmingly hot. It was burning with fever. Yet the moment Esther's fingertips made contact, the cat let out the faintest, most ragged purr, like an engine that hadn't been started in years, fighting desperately to turn over. Tears burst out of Esther without warning, not sliding down her cheeks one by one, but surging out as though some dam inside her, blocked for far too long, had finally shattered. She knelt in the rain, gathered that filthy, skeletal, half-dead cat into her arms, and sobbed so hard her whole body shook. Passers-by skirted around her, assuming she was mad. And in a way, she was driven mad by loneliness. A survivor of an emotional famine that had lasted far, far too long. She wrapped the cat inside her coat, hailed a cab, and took it to a 24-hour animal emergency room. The vet said the leg was an old injury, already healed badly out of alignment. It would need surgery. The cat was severely malnourished, had a respiratory infection, and the ruined eye would have to be removed. "What's the estimate for all of that?" Esther asked. The vet named a figure. It was 2 full months of Esther's salary. "Do it," she said, without hesitation. Looking back later, she would think of that moment as the first time in her life she had made a decision based entirely on wanting rather than should. She wanted to save this cat, not out of moral obligation, not out of social expectation, but simply because, in that rain-soaked night, she had seen herself in the eye of a dying stray. The cat survived. Esther named her Tuesday, because that was the day they found each other, and also because Tuesday is the most unremarkable day of the week. Nobody celebrates Tuesday. Nobody looks forward to Tuesday. But Tuesday still shows up, quiet and stubborn, in every single week. After the surgery, Tuesday had one eye left and one functional hind leg. She walked with a lurch, and when she looked at people she had to tilt her head slightly, sizing up the world with her single amber eye. But she was alive, and in a manner both fierce and tender. She began to root herself into Esther's life. The first few weeks were brutal. Tuesday needed medication on a strict schedule, regular checkups, and help adapting to life on 3 legs. Esther woke at 5 every morning to syringe feed her, then cleaned the litter box, applied ointment to the wound, and made sure everything was in order before leaving for work. At lunchtime she no longer sat on the fire escape chewing bread. Instead she took the subway 40 minutes home to check on Tuesday, then 40 minutes back to the office. Her colleagues noticed the shift. She started glancing at photos on her phone between tasks all of Tuesday. From every angle, in every sleeping position. She started lingering in the break room, just to answer people's questions about the cat. "What's her name?" "Tuesday." "Why Tuesday?" "Because that's the day we met," she said. The pronoun sounded so strange, coming out of her own mouth, that she almost didn't recognize it. One day Megan stopped her in the hallway. "Esther, you look different lately." "Different how?" "There's light in your eyes now." Megan smiled. "I've never seen light in your eyes before." That night Esther came home to find Tuesday sprawled on the windowsill waiting for her. The cat saw her, jumped down the 3-legged landing, was clumsy as a stuffed animal being, tossed and limped towards her, butting her head against Esther's calf. Esther bent down, scooped her up, and buried her face in the warm fur. Tuesday produced that rumbling, chugging purr, like a tiny engine that would never stop, vibrating steadily against her chest. It hit Esther then that this was the first time in her life a living creature had waited for her to come home, not for her paycheck, not for her to finish chores, but just her presence, her warmth, her closeness. Late that night, Esther did something she thought she would never do again. She picked up her phone, scrolled to the very bottom of her contacts, and found a number she had saved 7 years before and never once dialed. It was for a therapist, a free service her college had offered. She had gone once, sat in the chair, said nothing, and left. She dialed the number. Unsurprisingly, it was disconnected. But she didn't hang up. Into the dead line, she said, "I want to get better." Then she hung up and made a new appointment. What happened next did not come with a fast-cut movie montage. Our heroine goes to therapy, takes up running, learns to bake, makes a circle of friends, and beams in the sunlight. Reality was much slower and far clumsier. The first time she went to see the therapist, she stood outside the door for 15 minutes. The second time, she cried in the waiting room until she couldn't speak. The third time, she finally began, in broken pieces, to talk about her childhood. The long silence after that slammed door. The image of her mother passed out on the sofa like a hollowed-out shell. The way she had decided at 14 that she would never need anyone again, because needing meant waiting. Waiting meant disappointment. And the pain of disappointment was so sharp that she would rather weld herself shut inside an iron box, with no doors and no windows. "But you saved a cat," said the therapist, a silver-haired woman who always tilted her head a little when she spoke, like a patient robin. "That's different." "Different how?" Esther was silent for a long time. "She needs me," she finally said. "And you need to be needed," the therapist finished for her. The words slid into Esther's chest like a key into a lock she'd long thought rusted shut. Yes, she needed to be needed. She had spent her whole life dodging the act of needing someone else, utterly convinced it would only bring harm. But she had forgotten that she could also be the one someone else needed. And that kind of need was safe, warm, a two-way channel in which giving and receiving happened at the same time. Tuesday was more than a cat. She was a mirror. Every day when Esther took care of her, she was also taking care of that 8-year-old girl standing alone in a kitchen, too small to reach the stove. Feeding Tuesday was like feeding the hunger of her own childhood. Treating Tuesday's wounds was like dressing her own, the ones that had never been properly bandaged. Saying "I love you" to Tuesday every day was like finally learning how to say those 3 words to herself. In the 3rd month, Esther went to a pet store to buy cat food and, in the aisle, met a man. He was holding a bag of grain-free kibble, studying the ingredient list with intense concentration. His sweater cuffs were slightly frayed, and there were traces of paint under his fingernails that would never wash out. He later told her he was an illustrator. He had an orange cat named Philosopher, because the cat always seemed to be appraising humanity with a deeply skeptical gaze. They talked for 15 minutes by the cat food shelves. Esther wasn't wearing gloves. She had forgotten them that day. His name was Leo. He looked her in the eye when he spoke, but in a way that didn't feel invasive. When he smiled, fine lines crinkled at the corners of his eyes, like a map that had been folded and unfolded so many times it was soft at the creases. He asked if she wanted to go to the cafe next door and sit for a bit. And she said yes, and heard her own voice say that yes. The word came out with a buoyancy she hadn't felt in a very long time. They didn't fall in love right away. Esther wasn't capable of that yet. But they started seeing each other once a week at first, at the same cafe, trading stories about their cats. Leo showed her his illustrations drawings, in which a one-eyed cat always appeared in some unexpected corner, a windowsill, the top of a bookshelf, nestled among the stars in the night sky. He had started drawing Tuesday even though he had never met her. "You've made her far too beautiful," Esther said, looking at the sketches. "I'm drawing the way you see her," Leo said. "In your eyes, this is what she looks like." Esther lowered her head. The latte art in her cup had dissolved into a brown cloud. She felt heat behind her eyes, but this time it wasn't grief. She remembered something she had read a long time ago. We love others because we are really loving the part of ourselves that most needs to be loved. She had seen her own loneliness in Tuesday, and in Leo's drawings she saw the tenderness she had never been able to voice. In every small kindness, she glimpsed that little girl huddled in a corner, waiting to be picked up. Time pushed forward at its unhurried, unsentimental pace. Tuesday transformed from a scrawny stray into a sleek, one-eyed, gloriously plump cat. Every morning at exactly 6:30, she headbutted Esther's face with her fuzzy skull until Esther got up to open a can of food. She loved sprawling across Esther's typing hands, sending a riot of nonsense characters across the keyboard. She would hiss warily when Leo visited, then 10 minutes later settle onto his lap and purr. Esther kept seeing the Robin-like therapist once a week. She began learning things she had once thought belonged to fairy tales. How to express a need, how to accept help, how to shake someone's hand without gloves on. She put a framed photo of Tuesday on her desk at work, and when people asked, she would smile and say, "This is my cat. She only has one eye, but she's the most beautiful cat in the world." One evening, she and Leo were sitting side by side on her old sofa. Tuesday curled in the gap between them. An old movie was playing on the television, the volume turned low. Leo reached out his hand, moving very, very slowly, as though giving her all the time in the world to flee, and eventually laid it over hers. Esther didn't pull away. She felt the heat of his palm dry, warm, slightly rough, completely different from the warmth of Tuesday's fur, but just as inviting, just as hard to leave. She looked down at their two hands stacked together and realized this was the first time in her adult life that she had willingly allowed another human being to touch her. Leo said nothing, just kept watching a movie he had already seen a dozen times. He understood how heavy this moment was, just as Esther understood that he understood. Some things don't need words. In fact, words are sometimes the clumsiest containers for emotion. Outside, the lights of Brooklyn burned their endless vigil. From a window somewhere below came the muffled sound of music, and in the distance, train rumbled over the elevated tracks. This city held 3 million lonely people, each with their own shattered story, each in some sense an orphan. But right then, in that apartment where the post-it notes had been peeled off one by one, a woman, a man, and a three-legged, one-eyed cat were squeezed onto the same sofa, forming a mosaic that could, at last, be called a home. Esther had once believed that love was a miracle that fell from the sky, blessing only the lucky. She knew now that love is more like an instinct you have to learn all over again. Just as Tuesday learned to walk on 3 legs, just as it took Esther nearly 3 decades to learn how to let another person come close. Love is not a passive waiting. It is a reaching out, clumsy, difficult and brave, again and again. She had reached out, and there were no gloves on her hands. People who have been starved of love are often not incapable of loving. Rather, in their earliest relationships they learned not to need, because needing meant the possibility of loss, and the pain of loss was simply too much to bear. This self-protective armor was a necessary survival strategy in childhood, but in adulthood it becomes a cage that locks from the inside. Tuesday, as a creature who needed to be needed, allowed Esther to experience safe emotional connection for the first time. In caring for the cat, she was also caring for the child inside her who had never been properly looked after. That healing was not instantaneous. She still needed therapy, still flinched sometimes, still retreated, but she had learned how to reach out. At the end of the story, Esther did not transform into a completely different person. She was still introverted, still cautious, still gripped by fear in certain moments, but she was no longer ruled by it. She had a cat, a budding relationship, and, most importantly, she had begun to believe she deserved to be loved. Being unloved is a wound, but it is not incurable. The first step towards healing is often taken in front of another, equally broken creature, by admitting your own brokenness, just as Esther did that rainy night, when she removed her gloves, touched a dying cat, and in doing so, touched the long-buried, soft, love-hungry place inside herself.